Once called political warfare, grew and changed in four big waves, each a generation apart. As the theory and practice of disinformation evolved, so did the terms that described what was going on. The first wave of disinformation started forming in the interwar years, during the Great Depression, in an era of journalism transformed by the radio, newly cutthroat and fast-paced. Influence operations in the 1920s and early 1930s were innovative, conspiratorial, twisted, and nameless for now. The forgeries of this period were often a weapon of the weak, and some targeted both the Soviet Union and the United States at the same time. In the second wave after World War II, disinformation became professionalized, with American intelligence agencies leading the way in aggressive and unscrupulous operations, compounded by the lingering violence of global war. The CIA now called its blend of covert, truthful revelations, forgeries, and outright subversion of the adversary political warfare, a sprawling and ambitious term. Political warfare was deadliest in 1950s Berlin, just before the wall went up. The Eastern Bloc, by contrast, then preferred the more honest and precise name, disinformation. Whatever the phrase, the goals were the same: to exacerbate existing tensions and contradictions within the adversary's body politic, by leveraging facts, fakes, and ideally a disorienting mix of both. The third wave arrived in the late 1970s, when disinformation became well-resourced and fine-tuned, honed and managed, lifted to an operational science of global proportions, administered by a vast, well-oiled bureaucratic machine. By then, the term active measures was widely used in the Soviet intelligence establishment and among its Eastern Bloc satellite agencies. The name stuck, and indeed was quite elegant, because it helped capture a larger conceptual and historical trend at play. After 1960, the measures were becoming progressively more active, with the East gaining an upper hand. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and any remaining sense of ideological superiority retreated. The fourth wave of disinformation slowly built and crested in the mid-2010s, with disinformation reborn and reshaped by new technologies and internet culture. The old art of slow-moving, highly skilled, close-range, labor-intensive psychological influence had turned high-tempo, low-skilled, remote, and disjointed. Active measures were now not only more active than ever before, but less measured, so much so that the term itself became contested and unsettled. Surviving our age of organized, professional deception requires a return to history. The stakes are enormous. For disinformation corrodes the foundation of liberal democracy, our ability to assess facts on their merits, and to self-correct accordingly. That risk is old. Yet the crush of a relentless news cycle means that everything feels new, breaking, headlong. Established orders appear fleeting, with views veering to the fringes and new fissures cracking open. The crisis of our Western democracies has too often been referred to as unprecedented. This sense of novelty is a fallacy, a trap. The election interference of 2016 and the renewed crisis of the factual has a century-long prelude, and yet, unprepared and unaware, most Democrats before the 2016 election, and most Republicans after the election, underestimated and played down the risks of disinformation. Conversely, many close observers of the highly contested Special Counsel investigation of 2017 to 2019, still not fully risk-aware after the 2016 election, ended up overestimating and playing up the effects of an adversarial campaign that was, although poorly executed, designed to be overestimated. The best, and indeed the only, potent antidote against such pitfalls is studying the rich history of political warfare. Only by taking careful and accurate measure of the fantastic past of disinformation can we comprehend the present and fix the future. A historical inquiry into the rise of active measures reveals a quintessentially modern story, one closely tied to the major cultural and technical trends of the past 100 years. The 20th century was a vast test lab of disinformation and professional, organized lying, especially during the interwar years and the Cold War. And yet, Western scholars and the wider public have largely chosen to ignore the history of organized deception. Historians usually prefer telling true stories to retelling fakes. There are exceptions. Several episodes have recently been well documented. For example, the tale of the Zinoviev letter, a 1924 forgery that turned into a major British political scandal, or the persistent 1980s hoax that AIDS was a weapon developed by the United States Army. The CIA's less aggressive cultural covert action campaign in the early Cold War is well explored, most famously the Congress of Cultural Freedom. Military deception at war is also well researched, but most 20th century disinformation operations have simply been forgotten, including some of the most extensive and successful. 21st century liberal democracies can no longer afford to neglect this past. Ignoring the rich and disturbing lessons of industrial-scale Cold War disinformation campaigns risks repeating mid-century errors that are already weakening liberal democracy in the digital age. Recognizing an active measure can be difficult. Disinformation, when done well, is hard to spot, especially when it first becomes public. It will therefore be helpful to clarify what an active measure is and what it is not. First, and most important, active measures are not spontaneous lies by politicians, but the methodical output of large bureaucracies. Disinformation was, and in many ways continues to be, the domain of intelligence agencies, professionally run, continually improved, and usually employed against foreign adversaries. Second, all active measures contain an element of disinformation. Content may be forged, sourcing doctored, the method of acquisition covert. Influence agents and cutouts may pretend to be something they are not, and online accounts involved in the surfacing or amplification of an operation may be inauthentic. Third, an active measure is always directed toward an end, usually to weaken the targeted adversary. The means may vary, creating divisions between allied nations, driving wedges between ethnic groups, creating friction between individuals in a group or party, undermining the trust specific groups in a society have in its institutions. Active measures may also be directed toward a single, narrow objective, to erode the legitimacy of a government, for example, or the reputation of an individual, or the deployment of a weapons system. Sometimes projects are designed to facilitate a specific political decision. These features, easily misunderstood, give rise to three widespread misconceptions about the nature of disinformation, which is generally seen as sophisticated, based on propagating false news and occurring in the public sphere. Almost all disinformation operations are, in fact, imperfect by design, run not by perfectionists, but pragmatists. Active measures are contradictory. They are covert operations designed to achieve overt influence, secret devices deployed in public debates, carefully hidden, yet visible in plain sight. This inherent tension has operational consequences. Over the decades, dirty tricksters in various intelligence agencies, Western and Eastern, have discovered that tight operational security is neither cost-effective nor desirable, for both partial and delayed exposure may actually serve the interests of the attacker. It is not an accident that disinformation played out in shifting shadows, not in pitch-black darkness. Often, at least since the 1950s, the covert aspect of a given disinformation campaign was only a veneer, imperfect and temporary by design. Also, disinformation is not simply fake information, at least not necessarily. Some of the most vicious and effective active measures in the history of covert action were designed to deliver entirely accurate information. In 1960, for example, Soviet intelligence produced a pamphlet that recounted actual lynchings and other gruesome acts of racial violence against African Americans from Tennessee to Texas. The KGB then distributed English and French versions of the pamphlet in more than a dozen African countries, under the cover of a fake African American activist group. In more recent memory, intelligence agencies have passed on genuine, hacked and leaked data to WikiLeaks. Even if no forgery was produced and no content altered, larger truths were often flanked by little lies, whether about the provenance of the data or the identity of the publisher. Finally, disinformation operations do not always take place in public. Some highly successful active measures reached their target audience without ever being publicized in a newspaper, radio broadcast, or pamphlet, and sometimes they were more effective for that very reason. The KGB called such operations silent measures. One of the most spectacular operations of all time was a silent measure, the Stasi-engineered outcome of West Germany's first parliamentary vote of no confidence in April 1972, which kept the Chancellor in power against the odds. Private victims will find it harder to dismiss a rumor or a forgery that is never subjected to public scrutiny and criticism. This book will extract three main arguments from the history of disinformation over the past century. The first argument is conceptual. At scale, disinformation campaigns are attacks against a liberal epistemic order, or a political system that places its trust in essential custodians of factual authority. These institutions, law enforcement and the criminal justice system, public administration, empirical science, investigative journalism, democratically controlled intelligence agencies, prize facts over feelings, evidence over emotion, observations over opinion. They embody an open epistemic order, which enables an open and liberal political order. One cannot exist without the other. A peaceful transition of power after a contested vote, for example, requires trusting an election's setup, infrastructure, counting procedures, and press coverage, all in a moment of high uncertainty and political fragility. Active measures erode that order, but they do so slowly, subtly, like ice melting. This slowness makes disinformation that much more insidious, because when the authority of evidence is eroded, emotions fill the gap. As distinguishing between facts and non-facts becomes harder, distinguishing between friend and foe becomes easier. The line between fact and lie is a continuation of the line between peace and war, domestically as well as internationally. Disinformation operations, in essence, erode the very foundation of open societies, not only for the victim, but also for the perpetrator. When vast, secretive bureaucracies engage in systematic deception at large scale and over a long time, they will optimize their own organizational culture for this purpose and undermine the legitimacy of public administration at home. A society's approach to active measures is a litmus test for its republican institutions. For liberal democracies in particular, disinformation represents a double threat. Being at the receiving end of active measures will undermine democratic institutions, and giving in to the temptation to design and deploy them will have the same result. It is impossible to excel at disinformation and at democracy at the same time. The stronger and the more robust a democratic body politic, the more resistant to disinformation it will be, and the more reluctant to deploy and optimize disinformation. Weakened democracies, in turn, succumb more easily to the temptations of active measures. The second argument is historical. When it comes to covert active measures, moral and operational equivalence between West and East, between democracies and non-democracies, only existed for a single decade after World War II. The CIA's skill at political warfare was significant in the 1950s, especially in Berlin, and was in practice on par with, or even more effective than, Soviet disinformation. Western intelligence agencies